Hello everybody and welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul and today I've got another quick tips video, this time about Forbidden Power. More generally, I want to talk about manifestations and their potential to move block and deny enemy tactics, but in particular I want to mention Forbidden Power because it does seem to be the best one of these. First, let's do a primer on the rules for manifestations as a groundwork for the rest of this video. First up, manifestations are summoned into play using their summon spell ability or summon prayer ability. They can't move the turn they're summoned, but they can be summoned in the enemy turn with magical intervention, and then that allows them to move in your turn because they weren't set up in that turn. They can use abilities, they can be destroyed just like normal units, but they can't use commands. So they can't use run 6, they can't reroll charges, they can't use all-out attack, and so on. They also are not units, which means they can't score battle tactics or contest objectives. Now, this not a unit thing is very confusing, and it's probably the most complicated part of the 4th edition rule set. It is, manifestations are not a unit, but they are treated as units in very specific whitelist of scenarios, which I have on screen there, taken from the core rules. We're just going to talk about the ones that matter when they matter. Most manifestations are kind of just walking around the battlefield, attacking, charging. They act more or less like units that you can add to your army every single turn. Some of them are a bit more specific. They may be stationary, but they'll have a very powerful effect. And as a reminder, banishing can only be done in your hero phase, and it can only be done once per unit. So one wizard can try to banish once, even if it's something like Nagash, who has 8 power level, he can only banish once per phase. And banishes are not reliable. There are very few dice roll modifiers available for a banish roll. There's very few rerolls, so it really does just come down to dice roll. Even though a 7+ is more likely than not, it still has a pretty good chance of failing. And also remember, because banishing is done in your hero phase, that means if you summon a manifestation in the enemy turn, their chance to do a banish has already ended, which means they can't banish it immediately. So a spell summoned with magical intervention cannot be removed with any abilities in the hero phase. It has to be dealt with in the movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, and then finally the combat phase. Now the purpose of this video is to discuss manifestations as a utility piece, and not just as a war scroll with, it moves this much, it has this many attacks, that sort of stuff is fine. That's very basic stuff. I want to talk about using manifestations to deny setting up enemy units. I want to talk about using manifestations to block space and some practical examples of when and how to do that, denying battle tactics like seize the center, take their flanks, take their lands, and so on. Remember that spells are cast before most units move or teleport in the movement phase. There's very few abilities in the game now that allow you to relocate something in the hero phase. Translocation for Stormcast is one of them. So once you get this manifestation in place, it is a wall that your opponent cannot finish a move on top of. They can move through it, of course, but they can't finish on top of them. And as a primer, of course, everything in this video that I'm going to talk about is assuming that the dice go your way. We do prefer using a hero like the Knight Arcanum who gets a +1 to casting summon spells, which does help offset the -1 to magical intervention, but ultimately spells are unreliable, but it's a dice game, so a chance at denying an enemy tactic is good enough. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Let's take a look at a very basic example of creating a choke point with your faction terrain. In this scenario, the Storm Reach portal has been placed such that a just over 3-inch gap is created between the terrain features, the tree in the middle right, and then the temple in the bottom right. This allows the Knight Arcanum to then summon something like a Jaws there. And you'll notice that the front of the Jaws is more than 3 inches from the Knight Arcanum, which means that no matter where an enemy finishes a charge on the Stormreach portal or on the Jaws, they will not be able to get into melee combat with the Arcanum. Do note, though, this does not work well against reserves in particular, or teleports or things like that, because they don't have to set up more than 9 inches away from terrain. They can just deep strike in, charge the terrain, all kinds of wacky stuff. So this is primarily for units that are moving around the board. You can see this in action here. The bridge was cast in order to deny space for a large group of Morbeg Knights, another group of Morbeg Knights, a third group of Morbeg Knights, Usharan, what appears to be a Ghoul King riding a zombie dragon. The bridge was cast in the enemy turn in order to deny space for melee combat. Most of the units in the Flesh Eater Court's army are no longer able to get into combat. They first have to kill this unit, and then they're able to do it. This drastically limits the amount of models that will be in range in order to fight. Another cool thing you can do with manifestations is cast them behind an enemy unit in order to redeploy. In this scenario on screen, I've got a unit of Hearthguard Berserkers facing off against Concussors. The Concussors are ready to unleash a charge. But before that, I want to make sure that my opponent doesn't get like a big 6-inch redeploy, and then that leaves me with a 3-inch plus 6-inch charge, or a 9-inch, which is unreliable. I'm sure you've seen those. In order to avoid that, a whole scenario from occurring, I've decided to cast a bridge behind this unit of Hearthguard Berserkers. They are no longer able to finish a redeploy any further away than they started. The southernmost point of the southernmost model will not be able to cross over, and since they can't finish a move on top of the bridge, the only way they can redeploy would be left or right, and in either case, my charge remains a 3 inches on those Concussors. If you're just shooting a unit, for example, if you're dropping Prosecutors or Dracoths into play with a 10-inch breath attack, and you want to do this to stop redeploy, don't forget that they can still countercharge. The bridge in particular is a very easy spell to charge through. The bridge in particular may be good at stopping enemies from redeploying into it, but it is not very good at stopping people from charging into it, because the models can just pass through. Here's another practical example. This is a game of Stormcast versus Lumineth. You can see in the top right corner, the Lumineth player deployed in a castle formation. They were very worried about the potential aggression from Stormcast. This list in particular had a tremendous amount of shooting. I think it had about 600 points of shooting in reserve, and it also had a unit of 6 Prosecutors, which can teleport anywhere and then get a 3d6 charge and reliably just kill something. The Lumineth player, using tech lists, decided to deploy a null space, like an empty space, and they obviously intended to summon a spell, probably a Gravetide, into that space. Now, the Gravetide, as a moving manifestation, will stop enemy units from setting up within 9 inches. This means that any deep strike shooting will not be able to land there and will not be able to reach the Sentinels. Prosecutors won't be able to land anywhere near the units that they want to charge. So this seems like a really good strategy. Since Teclis has guaranteed casts, he can sit at the backfield. If I decide to deploy a Knight Arcanum or any kind of Unbind close enough, he can flip the script and take first because he had fewer drops than I did. He could determine priority order. He could just pick up a free wizard. Instead, he gave priority to the Stormcast player, and what they did was they chanted Translocate and placed the Lord Arcanum in the space that they wanted to put the Gravetide. Now, Teclis, of course, has to use Magical Intervention at the end of the hero phase, so there was no opportunity for them to have any kind of counterplay. The manifestation cannot be set up within 9 inches of the Arcanum, and that means that now the Stormcast player can place their Prosecutors there in the movement phase, or they can place shooting units from reserve. And as a fun side note, the Lord Arcanum then later teleported away in the movement phase in order to score Take Their Land. Here's another easy thing you can do with spells. If you see your opponent is positioning to score Take Their Land early on, you can try to deny it with an endless spell. If they're relying on things like teleports or reserves, you can place an endless spell on the terrain in such a way that they can no longer just deploy a unit directly onto the terrain. They have to risk a 9-inch charge, potentially more based on your positioning. So this really generally works against units that want to use reserves and teleports, that want to set up more than 9 inches from enemies. And this only works with moving manifestations, of course. Stationary manifestations do not stop enemies from deploying into combat with them. Another very situational use, and this does require some dice rolls to go your way and poorly for the opponent as well, but it is something that's occurred in games for me. You can try to take their flanks. If you see your opponent is setting up a slow unit on one flank, like a chaff unit like Liberators, or maybe something even a little bit faster, what you can do is set up a manifestation on that corner. The battle plan shown here is Border Ward, and the territories go halfway up the board, which means you are more than 9 inches away. So Liberators, which only move 5 inches, would need to run at least 4 inches in order to guarantee the tactic. So most likely, these Liberators are deployed to use the @the double command and then score Take the Flanks. Now, in this case, you could try to summon a moving manifestation, because you know that you cannot finish a normal move in combat, which means that the Liberators would have to move up 5 inches and then try to attempt a charge. Now, that's not a guaranteed charge by any means. It's about a 7 on the dice, because you're setting up about 9 plus 3, 12 inches away. It's not a guarantee, but it is more resources than perhaps your opponent wanted to invest. Maybe they don't have a spare command point in order to reroll charges. Maybe you're just forcing them to burn command points by putting an endless spell there. And then they still have to survive the combat with the endless spell that you put down. So the Jaws in this case might do enough damage to kill enough Liberators. A large stationary spell like the Bridge can also do this. You'll notice that the Liberators can charge here, and they can charge through the spell in order to get to the other side, but they will not be able to just move or run, which means they have to fully charge all the way through. Every part of every model in the unit has to finish the charge on the other side of the bridge, which is a harder charge than if you were to put down just that single spell. So you may have noticed in the examples I've shown before, I am using the Soulscream Bridge for a lot of movement blocking, and there's a good reason for that. It is very easy to cast, only needing a 6+. It has a huge range of 18 inches. Both parts seem to be set up within 9 inches of each other and not wholly within. It also just takes up a tremendous amount of space. These are 220 mil oval bases. Also surprisingly durable, 12 health and a 4-up save. That's not trivial to remove. It's not something like a Horrorghast, which is 6 health and a 6-up save. Now, the cool thing about stationary spells is they can be set up any range from enemy units. You don't have to worry about whether you're setting them up in combat or not. You can also set it up in choke points between terrain features. You can deny enemy charges from reaching your real units. This is particularly potent if you have bonuses to casting and your opponent has no shooting in their army. So, for example, if they're playing something like Slave to Darkness that doesn't bring any shooting units, well, they really struggle to chop down enough bridges in order to get to your units. This just nukes a whole turn of combat for them. In addition to being a really good blocking piece, the Deathly Passage ability on the Soulscream Bridge is quite useful as well. Units can move and then use the teleport. You don't have to start your movement phase in range of this ability, so you could, for example, run a unit, then teleport it away. It also doesn't count as a retreat move, which is really interesting. Which means that if you cast it near units that are in combat, they can teleport and still shoot. You can also chain teleports together, for example, using the bridge and then the portal to go anywhere. You could also consider this as a backup translocation in your list. For example, if you have a priest and a wizard, your priest tries to chant translocation, it doesn't go off, but it's okay, you still have a second chance to teleport a unit using the Soulscream Bridge. You can also do neat things like translocate a unit forward to use hero phase abilities, usually spells, and then take the bridge back to safety. Here's an example of using the bridge to teleport units out of combat. You can see the Judicators were deployed from reserve to score Reclaim the Realms, which meant one unit had to be in that quarter, and they could also capture the objective. But then they were charged and they got stuck in combat. The bridge was summoned to allow the Judicators to teleport out of combat. And note that they can still shoot later that turn as well, because this is not a retreat ability. Judicators in particular can teleport in range to use Step into the Portal from the Stormreach portal, and then teleport anywhere on the field. So you can see they can go all the way from one side of the table to the other, just from having the bridge and no priest. You can save your chant for something else, or not bring a priest at all. Here's another example using more or less the same scenario. In this case, the Stegodon went toe-in on the objective. Adjudicators deployed from reserve to shoot it 18 inches away, which of course puts them in charging range. But then a bridge is summoned in the Seraphon player's turn in order to deny space for melee combat. You can see that the front of the bridge is more than 3 inches from the Adjudicators, so there is no way for this Stegodon to finish a charge such that it will be in combat with the Adjudicators, even after a pile-in move. Because remember, you can move through spells, you can't finish on top of them. And if an opponent is using a Soulscream Bridge to teleport units forward, don't forget, you can cast a spell on top of it with Magical Intervention, and then units can't set up within 9 inches of that spell. So in this example, you can see a bridge has been summoned, the Stormcast player then drops in Endless Life Swarm, which is a very easy cast. They drop it at the edge of the bridge, and now units cannot set up within 9 inches of that spell, which means, effectively, you can't use the bridge to teleport. The Shards of Valagharr are Valagharr, whatever. They're also a very easy cast. They also have a huge range, 18 inches, and they must be set up within 9 inches of each other. They're basically like a bridge in the sense that they're less durable, they take up less space, but you can think of them as a backup bridge, because there could be times where you cast the bridge in order to block something, and then your opponent gets a double turn, or you just don't have an opportunity to banish it and your opponent didn't destroy it, and you want a second spell, well bam, Shards of Valagharr are there for you. You can also use Phantasmal Translocation immediately on your turn, which is pretty neat. It is not a move keyword ability, so it can be used. What makes the Shards an interesting counterpart to the bridge, although they are smaller, they have a lot more utility. So any army that relies on setting up units, the Shards really, really hurts them. Like, for example, Karajan Overlords, they like to redeploy their Ironclad and then teleport units. But if you cast the Shards around the Ironclad, it just can't do that ability anymore because it can't redeploy far enough, and then it can't set up the units anywhere near the Shards. It is worth noting that the shards specifically stop enemy units from setting up and not models. So for example, if you have an ability like Horrors that causes them to split and set up models in the unit, that is different than setting up a unit, so the shards will not work. It will not prevent that ability. It also does not stop setting up manifestations, because manifestations are not units, and manifestations only stop enemy units from setting up within 9 inches. So you can always cast a Predatory Endless spell directly on top of the shards. Also worth noting that this does not block flying for other manifestations, because again, they are not units, so they will not be affected by this ability, because manifestations are only affected by abilities when they are the target of the ability. It also doesn't block flying during pile-in moves, because a pile-in move is not a move keyword ability. So here's a very simple example of how to use the shards. You can see that the shards are being put on the right side of the screen in order to deny a tremendous amount of space for reserves and teleports. This is the most amount of area denial you can get from a single spellcast like this. Another practical example is that the shards can be put on top of a Gnawhole from the Skaven to prevent them from using a movement phase ability to teleport into the Gnawhole. You can see in the bottom left, 2 shards have been set up such that no units can come through the portal. I mentioned the Ironclad earlier. Now, I don't have an Ironclad. I don't collect Kharadron Overlords, but I took this quick photo. So pretend that the Star Drake is an Ironclad and pretend that those Hearthguard Berserkers are actually Thunderers. This is a pretty typical setup for KO. They will have a unit wholly within 6 inches of the Ironclad. That way, when the Ironclad uses Redeploy, the Thunderers can be teleported to the other side of it, protecting them and allowing them still to use Covering Fire, because they didn't use a run move. It was the Ironclad that used the run move. This is a very annoying tactic, but let's say we summon some shards behind them. The shards prevent the Ironclad from finishing a redeploy that much further away. You can see there's maybe 1 or 2 inches that it could move back. But more importantly, it also prevents him from setting up models behind the Ironclad. There is no space that they can set up models that within 6 inches of the shards and wholly within 6 of the Ironclad. This means that the Thunderers can't use their trick in order to escape from a frontal assault. You can come in from the left or the right. Either way, the redeploy tactic is greatly reduced in potency. Let's say you don't have a wizard in range to cast it perfectly. Well, if you use something like Translocate or some other hero phase movement ability, you can get a wizard in range, get the right angle, and then you can still cast the shards wholly within 18, because their setup range is just so huge. It's quite easy to do this tactic. Kharadron are not known for having tons and tons of bodies. You will almost certainly find the right angle. And then let's think about the Ironclad being aggressive. So it wants to move up, and then it wants to teleport the unit of Thunderers that are there. In this case, the shards have been summoned in the enemy turn. The Ironclad cannot set up the Thunderers within 6 inches of the shards, and Thunderers only shoot 18 inches, which means that as long as you're more than 12 inches from the front of the shards, you can't be shot by this kind of Ironclad teleporting maneuver, because you'll just be outside of that 18 inches. Horrorghast is another excellent spell in this spell lore. All 3 of the spells I've talked about so far are fantastic. It is also an easy cast. It must be more than 9 inches from enemy units, but that's okay because it has a 10-inch shooting attack, so it gets to impact the board immediately. It's also a moving spell, which means it denies enemies setting up within 9 inches. It also has shoot in combat, so it's unlike some other stuff that gets stuck in combat and then can't do anything. This thing can keep pumping out damage as long as it's on the table. It's also surprisingly accurate. Hits on 2s, wounds on 3s, Rend 2, going up to Rend 3 against infantry. Now, 6 damage max is really bad against something like zombies or Gits or high health armies in general, but against Stormcast or Slaves to Darkness, this is fantastic. Enemies can redeploy, guaranteed they can redeploy 1 inch in order to deny it, but that's probably a waste of command points. Maybe, right? Like it could be a good use. It's worth keeping in mind that this is not a foolproof ability. Your opponent has a counter to it. It exists. It's just there. And let's talk about the Harbinger of Horror ability. This is really, really cool against some armies, against something like Gargants, where they just will not take losses by definition, then this is not a very good ability. If you manage to kill models from a unit that the Horrorghast sent any number of attacks to, you can shut off commands for the rest of the turn, potentially. So you can do things like deny covering fire, deny countercharge, deny all-out defense. There's lots of cool command abilities that you can shut off with this. It can be difficult to activate it against 2 to 4 model units, and in situations like that, I would say just treat it as a bonus. It's not your primary plan. It's not the reason you took the lore, but it is just a nice, icing on top. The ability itself can be used at any point in the shooting phase, which means you can put all of your other shooting into a unit and then activate the Horrorghast ability and then shut off commands. And keep in mind that the Horrorghast doesn't have to deal any damage. It only has to target an enemy, which means you could potentially pick 6 different units with its 6 attacks, and that way your opponent has no idea which one of them you're going to be using Harbinger of Horror on later. In fact, models don't have to be hurt or killed by the Horrorghast. As long as any models were in that unit, and the Horrorghast picked that unit with its attacks, you can activate Harbinger of Horror on that unit. Now, people may be familiar with this, and they might, use all-out defense in order to mitigate losses before commands are shut off. But, of course, you are aware that they're aware of this, which means you could try to do something like bait out all-out defense on a unit by shooting with the Horrorghast first, and then switch targets after it's used. You can pick 2 or 3 different targets to make it more difficult to know which one's going to be the Harbinger of Horror target. But this is all extra, right? Really, it's just 6 damage shooting at Ren 2. Sometimes you just take 6 points off like a Glutos after summoning it. It's a great little spell. I love it. Lauchon the Soulseeker is kind of the odd duck out. It has a higher cast value. It doesn't take up as much space. It's not as useful as the Horrorghast. It doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play because you can't use its ability the turn it's summoned because it's a move keyword ability. So Lauchon looks really bad, but it's still a spell, and it's still a moving spell, and moving spells still have utility. To demonstrate that, you can see this kind of example I've concocted where I've placed a chariot on one side in order to deny setting up and reserves on the right side of the board, and I've put the rest of the army, let's just say there's more stuff on the table, it's going to focus on the left side. So I'm going, mostly central with my cavalry unit, that way it can swing left or right, and then I've got like a dangling unit on the side just to contest objectives. But it is important, let's say it's important in this scenario, to deny reserves. Well, I don't want to put my Knight Arcanum onto the objective, right? I don't want to lose that early. I don't want to have to put my big meaty block of Concussors and Lord Celestin on Dracoth onto that objective. What I want to do is put my Chariot on there. It's not a very expensive unit. If it dies, it's okay. It gets value just from scoring for a turn. But that space that it leaves now allows things to teleport into that space. So what you can do is summon Lauchon, or any moving spell, right? This isn't a tactic unique to Lauchon. But since we're talking about Forbidden Power, it is worth using him in this example. Here, Lauchon is summoned to replace the Chariot and prevent enemies from setting up. Now, remember that enemies can banish in their hero phase before using teleports in the movement phase. So, when possible, if you're using this kind of endless spell to avoid a movement phase teleport, try to summon the spell outside of 30 inches from units that can banish, such as priests and wizards. Alright, that'll do it for this video. Hopefully it's around the 20-minute mark. I'm trying to do that with these quick tips. Hope this video was interesting and useful. If you think I missed anything, or you have some other cool trick, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. If you want to talk about Age of Sigmar, then join the Stormkeep Discord server. We talk about AOS all day, every day. And consider supporting the gang by becoming a member on YouTube or joining us on patreon.com/thestormkeep. And that's it. We'll see you in the next one.